At the end of the Third Age, Sauron's dominion had spread across much of the south and east of Middle-earth, but when Sauron was destroyed, his empire collapsed overnight, his vast dominions broken and leaderless. That raises the question, did Sauron have a successor? If not, why? And if he did, why didn't they fill the power vacuum? Perhaps the greatest indicator of how important Sauron was to his dominion came immediately after his defeat at the Battle of the Morannon, the Black Gate. In the Peter Jackson films, the ground collapses from the shockwave of the One Ring's destruction and Mount Doom's explosion, conveniently swallowing up Sauron's armies, but that doesn't really happen in the books. In actuality, despite being enormously outnumbered, the host of the West prevails in the battle, and elements of it even begin occupying the northern parts of Mordor, such as Udun. Without Sauron, most of his army simply flees, some even kill themselves, and only a few of his most fervent followers, mostly Easterlings and Haradrim, continue to fight to the death. With Sauron gone, why didn't someone take over? Well, simply put, Sauron never named a successor, and why would he? Sauron was an immortal angelic being who wanted to rule all of Middle-earth. He never named a successor because A, although he could certainly feel fear, he did not believe he would be destroyed, not at least while the One Ring existed, and B, he did not care about his legacy. Mordor was not some kingdom that he was leaving behind. If he was destroyed, he would simply no longer care for it. So Sauron never named a successor. But that doesn't mean that someone else could have put themselves forth as a successor. You might be thinking, why not the Nazgul? That seems like an obvious answer, the Witch King was destroyed, but why not Khamûl or one of the others? But the simple fact is that the Nazgul were bound to the One Ring through their own rings of power, and once the One Ring was destroyed, so were they. So in any scenario where Sauron is destroyed, so too are the Nazgul, meaning they are not viable successors. This leaves other possibilities. We know Sauron had other powerful underlings who were high up in the hierarchy, the Mouth of Sauron and the mysterious Gothmog, for example, probably amongst many others. Why didn't they step forward and attempt to calm the storm? And I just want to say, this is actually a story that Lord of the Rings Online deals with. Following Sauron's defeat, many of his most powerful surviving servants actually have a civil war over who should become the new ruler of Mordor. It's really cool. If you haven't played it, you should check it out. Back to the question. We have to assume that much of Sauron's hierarchy was also wiped out. Even before the Battle of the Morannon, Sauron's forces had been defeated in many places across Middle-earth, probably robbing him of some capable leaders. Not that it matters, as long as Sauron is alive, the rest are replaceable. But when the One Ring was destroyed, Mount Doom erupts, Mordor is rent asunder by an earthquake, Barad-dûr collapses, as do the Towers of Teeth on either side of the Black Gate. It would be a safe assumption that many of Sauron's most powerful servants actually perished in this catastrophe. Let's assume you are one of Sauron's most powerful servants. Let's say a black Númenórean commander such as the Mouth of Sauron. You've survived Sauron's downfall. What's your next move? Well, Sauron's armies have now either been scattered or destroyed, and some of Mordor's primary fortifications have been destroyed. Things are looking grim, but maybe you can rally together some of Sauron's former power. Maybe. And this is where I want to talk about just how important Sauron was to his whole dominion. Let's take orcs for example. Orcs are naturally chaotic and self-destructive. Without a powerful leader directing and controlling them, usually through fear, orcs retreat into dark places, fight amongst themselves, and ultimately dwindle. Now, that powerful leader doesn't need to be a Dark Lord. The Witch King did it in Angmar, and so did powerful orc chieftains such as Azog and Bolg. But if you want to regather Sauron's orcish hordes, you're going to need to be an exceptionally powerful and controlling individual who the orcs both fear and respect. Of course, not all of Sauron's servants were orcs. Many were men, Easterlings and Haradrim, and there's a few problems if you style yourself as Sauron's successor. Firstly, Rhûn and Harad are not unified nations. They're vast lands made up of vast peoples, and they're not all the same. Some of them worship Sauron as a literal god, and with his destruction, their societies will descend into chaos as they try to come to terms with a new future. Some of them were oppressed by Sauron and will be all too eager to throw off his shackles, and they probably won't look kindly upon his former servants. Secondly, men are ambitious, and if you are attempting to bring Sauron's former dominions back into the fold, you would undoubtedly end up being challenged by rivals, many of whom would have entirely different goals. Okay, assuming you have some moderate success and manage to build yourself a nice little army in Mordor, you have another problem that Sauron was able to overcome. Mordor is a wasteland. I've seen many people ask, how did Sauron feed his armies? The answer is Nirn, Mordor's southern region, which is fertile enough to grow food. These farms were worked by hordes of slaves who were shipped in from the east, and the food that grew was then shipped into Mordor. Mordor was a well-oiled machine with a logistics system that could only be managed by Sauron himself, a being who was unmatched in the powers of order and control. That's not hyperbole, that is Sauron's whole shtick. So Sauron's successor has huge immediate challenges at home. They must find a way to reassert control over the orcs, they must find a way to bring Sauron's mannish allies back into the fold, and they must find a way to replicate Sauron's complex logistics systems so that their newly gathered armies don't just starve and rebel. Then they must get to work re-establishing new bases of power. Barad-dûr and the Black Gate must be rebuilt, and without Sauron, those structures would never be as imposing as they originally were. And then there's another problem. If a successor starts to find some success within Mordor, Gondor and King Elessar are simply not going to sit back and let it happen. Like I said, in the books, the host of the West actually begins to occupy parts of Mordor, and Elessar makes a decree that places like Minas Morgul will be completely destroyed. It wasn't a matter of Sauron's dead, pack it up and go home. They were well aware that there was plenty of work to be done. They were set on destroying the remnants of Sauron's power, and that would include any self-styled successors. But let's give this potential successor the benefit of the doubt. Let's say that they are particularly competent and lucky. What other challenges do they face? Well, the challenge of mortality. Sauron could afford to wait millennia because time did not faze him. In fact, time was his ally. Even in Angmar, the Witch King spent 600 years trying to destroy Arnor because time was a non-issue for him. But if you're an orc, or a man, or even a black Númenórean, you're on a timer if you want to finish what Sauron started. Your window of opportunity is measured in decades, not centuries, and given the destruction that took place in Mordor, centuries is probably what is needed. And then you face the problem of having to name a successor of your own. That's not to make it sound like you need to be a Dark Lord to threaten the Westlands. Throughout the Third Age, plenty of unnamed Easterling, Haradrim, and Corsair leaders were up for the challenge, but these were leaders leading their native peoples, united against a foreign power. It's not the same as a Sauron wannabe trying to cobble together Sauron's old power in Sauron's old lands. There's a reason why no one tried to reclaim Mordor before Sauron's servants returned. So to summarize it, Sauron did not name a successor because he did not believe he needed one, nor would he actually care for one. That's not the way his mind worked. But could one have stepped forth? Potentially, provided they survived the aftermath of Sauron's downfall, but the odds would have been heavily stacked against them, and it's extremely likely that they would have failed. The simple reality was, Sauron was Mordor, and Mordor was Sauron, and there wasn't really anyone else who could take up that mantle. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, or at least found it interesting. I mentioned Lord of the Rings Online earlier, and how the Mordor expansion dealt with Sauron's potential successors trying to one-up each other in the ruins of Mordor. It really was an interesting story, and once again, I recommend you play it if you haven't, although I will warn you it's fairly far into the game. Cheers, farewell, and remember, being a Dark Lord isn't all fun and games. There's a lot of work involved too.